American colonist ancestors have fought a long and hard war for us to rid ourselves of the English king setting up our government in what we would call a democratic constitutional republic instead of a monarchy. And yet today we still seem fascinated by the British royal. If you do a Google search on that topic, you'll find that each year since about 2011, some of the top articles have been about the question, why are we still so obsessed with the British royals? According to these articles, our obsession with the British monarchy has its roots in our general interest in celebrities. You see them on the screen there, the most recent version, Prince Harry and Meghan. And be it as it was, the British royals does not mean that monarchies are what we think they are. No genuflecting for we Americans. That's right, no curtsy for us. Worldwide, 26 royal families rule. Did you know that? In more than 40 countries. And it's fair to say that very few of you could name even one or two of them. I know I couldn't. We likely know little about their form of government even, because in those nations, many of them are constitutional monarchies. That means the king and the queen, they ain't in charge. Nope, they're just a part of a process, and they are restrained in their power by a parliament. And that is the case in the United Kingdom. There are, however, 6 absolute monarchies in the world. And the most famous one, you will not even know that you know it. But the most famous one, everyone in this room knows. It's called the Vatican. There are a republic with democratically elected leaders, not an absolute monarchy all over the world. And so today we're going to visit a story where we're going to talk about the folks in Israel who want a king. They have been fascinated by this, and so now they want a king. Israel wants a king. They are pressing their new prophet priest, Samuel. Notice that. He shared dual duties, a prophet religiously and a priest, which connected him very much so to the hierarchy. And so all the nations around have a monarchy, and they want one. And so they look around into the context and the history. And so if you want just the briefest line or two of a history of where we have gotten to in this particular passage in Samuel, it is this. From Exodus, when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, to the time of Samuel is a period of 250 years. So in those 250 years, the Israelites had understood themselves as a kind of loose confederacy of tribes, all maybe like colonies, if you would. But no king, but God himself. So throughout time, God called human leaders to come along and to take the reins as needed. First, we all know, if we've been around our Bible at all, that the first one was Moses. And then along came a fellow by the name of Joshua, and then they came to begin to believe in judges. And so the first judge was Samuel. He was one of them, and he ended up, by the way, being the last. Samuel, interestingly, as an aside to all this, had 2 sons. If you remember your Old Testament, he had 2 sons, and he allowed them to kind of get intermixed in the process. And so Samuel, for all his usual obedience to God, gets a little confused here and begins acting on his own a bit instead of waiting for God's direction, and he begins instituting a hereditary line of succession. Imagine that. In any case, the people quickly realized that they were getting into a bad situation. And so they looked all around them, and they saw all these monarchs and that was going on with kings. And so Samuel's sons did not follow in his ways, it says in Scripture, but turned aside after gain, and they took bribes and perverted justice. So the tribal elders, they get together and they come up with a plan. And so they begin to approach Samuel, asking him to give them a king to govern them. And so Samuel, in turn, seeks God's advice. And this is where we get to Scripture, and I'm going to share a little bit of that. he spells out that there is a downside to having a king. Now, I'm going to read for you that downside. It's in verses 11 through 18 of chapter 8. 11 through 18 of chapter 8. Samuel says, and they still wanted a king after this. Samuel says, this is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons, he will make them serve in the chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and your vintage, and he will give it to the officials and the attendants. And your male and your female servants, and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. And when that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. But they still wanted a king. Can you imagine? Why do we want a king? Why do we want something we don't have? Why do we want somebody to take care of us? Why is it that people have always that leaning to go in that direction? Well, because we want a God with skin on. Next movement in the message. A God with skin. You see, apparently the Israelites had come to the place where they decided that they wanted to be governed, but it was not enough to be governed by God. And so life sometimes pushes us to a conclusion. As Christians, we may view God as our ultimate leader and try to apply that in faith, but ultimately we find ourselves leaning toward other persons. And so we may also find at times that it seems that God is not enough. Usually it happens when we are in immense pain, or we are in immense loss, or we are just simply having a difficult time. We look around and God has not in our minds been enough, and so we go looking. Whenever I do a message that has a negative in it, I always think of the time that I did a series on Jesus, and I called it The Failures of Jesus. And now, before that series I explained how we're going to talk about how people perceived that Jesus had failed. Not that he had failed, but that they had perceived it. But a little lady who didn't come regularly read the title of this message series that I was doing, and even though she barely knew her new pastor of 2 years, she called me to give me an earful. That I would dare to talk about Jesus' failures. I said, no, ma'am, no, you come and see. We'll work our way through that. This whole issue of skin, we talk a lot about at Christmas. Do you remember the Christmas story? We probably use it every 3 to 4 years. We remember the little girl who had gone through a trauma in her life. There was a thunderstorm going on or something, and so she calls out to her mother. She's in bed, and her mother comes in and says, don't worry, God will take care of you. And she says, well, God is not enough to deal with my fright. I want somebody with me who has skin on. And so we all have that tendency, don't we? Have you ever thought something that you're facing in your life, you don't just want to face it alone, that you really do have somebody that you want to connect to you? Now, it didn't take long for me to find a point of contact this week, as we have had a horrendous week in terms of suicides. Most all of you will know at least one or both of these folks. Anthony Bourdain is an original, what they call the original rock star of the culinary world. A best-selling author, a recipient of 2 Emmy Awards, and considered to be the most influential chef in the world. He was in Strasbourg, France this past week, where he was recording an episode of his CNN show and was found dead with apparent suicide in his hotel room. But the tragic news follows the death of fashion designer Kate Spade, who took her life last Tuesday. Her husband would later say that she had been dealing with anxiety and depression, had been seeing doctors and taking medication for the past 5 years. Now, let me give you some statistics. This will, I suspect, boggle your mind. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention reported that suicide rates have increased 25% since 1999. They rose in every state. And let me give you a statistic that will, in fact, blow your mind. In 2016, there were more than twice as many suicides as homicides. And according to the CDC, more than half the people who died by suicide did not have a known medical condition, although I will tell you that most folks who deal with issues like that are rarely diagnosed. Now, the list, if you go on the website for these CDC folks, they give you a list of symptoms of things that might be going on in your life. And so let me share this. None of these will be a surprise, probably. Relationship problems, crisis in the past or upcoming 2 weeks, problematic substance abuse or health issues. How about job or financial issues, criminal or legal problems, or the loss of housing? All of those things can fit in. Now, the Bible does not say much about suicide. King Saul, interestingly, who's a little bit in our story here, fell on his sword when he knew he was about to be captured. And we all know about Judas Iscariot, who grieved himself literally to death over what he had done to Jesus. This mental pain and anguish is not easy to talk about, is it? Mental pain, according to C.S. Lewis, is less dramatic than physical pain, but it is more common and more difficult to bear, according to him. I like how he says, the frequent attempt to conceal mental pain increases the burden, and it is easier to say my tooth is aching than to say my heart is broken. Now, I've dug into this whole issue this week a bit, and I'm going to share with you not only personally but biblically. Too often, Christians feel that depression should simply be handled spiritually instead of medically. Depression is an illness that needs both. Let me just say very, very clearly, I have never counseled anybody not to seek both medical and spiritual assistance. An article by Kristen Powers in the USA Today this week addresses not only her own issue with attempted suicide or looking at suicide, but also she highlighted a book for me that I had not read or probably will. It's by Johann Hari, and it's a best-selling book called Lost Connections. It's the subtitle that's interesting. Uncovering the real causes of depression and the unexpected solutions. And it largely says it's an epidemic in our Western world, but it's largely caused by key problems in the way that we live. Now, let me take that apart a little bit. We exist largely disconnected from extended family, friends, and communities. And in all of the situations that I have often dealt with over the last 30 years of my ministry, most often, and believe me, I've dealt with plenty of suicides. Plenty. One of the very first funerals I did in my little part-time church at Hillgrove Baptist Church was a suicide. And I could enumerate the number of suicides that I've dealt with. There is always what I would consider a mental frustration, and call it what you want, but it manifests itself where a person acknowledges that they know something is wrong. My hope is that as we have this discussion today, and maybe by way of television today, somebody who's dealing with the issue of suicide will in fact think twice about this. While there are people with chemical imbalances that should be supported with medicine, I absolutely believe many, many Americans are depressed or anxious or suicidal because something is missing that our culture does not offer them, not because something is necessarily wrong with them. Our culture is so isolated today. We live by media. We live by distance. And we communicate lots of things, but nothing that I would call that's powerful and intimate. And And so, let me tell you my story. My family has dealt with depression all of our lives at some level. Every member of my family has dealt with it at some point. So it was not difficult for me to have some personal knowledge about depression. But I will tell you, I deal with it on such a regular basis at the church that you need to know that sometimes I get calls where issues are like this. It was a panic attack. And a person was needing help, and I said, what can I do? And I did two things. I said, I am coming to you right now, and I'm calling Doc Snyder on my way. Doc Snyder, many of you know, is a psychiatrist in our church that I have talked and worked with for many, many years since I've been here. He told me exactly what I needed to know medically about this person. I knew what I needed to do when I got there in terms of my ministerial presence. And those two persons got that person through the night and to the next day and to the next day. And I will tell you that Doc Snyder still sees this person. And I talked with this person this week, and they told me, I am through a major crisis in my life. I tell you that because it took both. Why? And this is where I found another phrase that I never heard, but I thought was interesting. God is not liquid. Now, I had never heard that phrase, but I dug into it. There's a writer by the name of Grace Pennington who talks about this, and she says it this way. She says, our hearts seem to be need factories. You know, we go around, I need. And we're told that Jesus is the answer for all of that. And she goes on to say, it's as though we spend our days carving hollows into our hearts, hollows that are shaped just to fit the objects of our necessities and our desires. Now get where she's going here. Knowing that God is all we need doesn't seem to abate the inner longings for a happy marriage or a time of rest or a fellowship or more money. Those holes still feel empty, and their emptiness seems to weigh us down. She continues, I can sometimes get angry with God when my emptiness is particularly heavy. Then, of course, I feel guilty for my anger. How many people have done that? And after all, God is all I need. Then a half-realized panic starts to creep in. Is God really enough? The problem, she says, is that God isn't liquid. Look what she's saying. He doesn't exist to fill holes we manufacture in our hearts. He is a solid. He is his own shape, rather than taking the shape of that which he inhabits. She points out that in Ezekiel, God tells us that he will remove the heart of stone from us and replace it with a heart of flesh, so that our hearts aren't meant to be hard, hollow receptacles for God to fit himself into, but rather it's not about God being enough to fill our needs anymore. It's about him being more than enough, filling us in ways we didn't expect that we even needed. I have discovered that in my own life. 30 years ago, if I gave you my list of needs, they would have a lot more me in them than they do today. As I've walked my faith experience with God, less and less of my needs are just about me. And the joy and the incredible opportunity we have to give our lives to other people appropriately on his behalf. What's our love God, love others, and what? Tell our stories. I'm convinced, I didn't know who Anthony Bourdain was until my son started telling me about him. All Anthony does is tell stories about people and how we are all just the same kind of people when we sit around a table and share a meal together. You have an enemy? Try to have a meal with them. Try to have a meal without throwing the meal at them, by the way. So let's finish our time with just simply talking about the enoughness of God. The enoughness of God. You and I, on a regular basis, go through all kinds of stuff. And our stuff may not be the kind that hits the newspaper and is with famous people, or we see a tragedy happening around the world or around the corner. But we go through stuff every week, every day, and what you and I need to decide is what we're going to do and how we're going to live that experience out. For some of us, this whole issue of depression is front and center. You deal with it on a regular basis. And I would simply say, do not let yourself get isolated. Talk to somebody, and talk to somebody who can help you. So what would I offer you? I would offer you some rusty tools. Author Anne Lamott, you're going to see a picture of her. She is an odd-looking duck. She is an author that I have read for years. She was a single mother who found her way to the Lord after several years of drug and alcohol abuse. A great part of what enabled her to do that, and she will tell you, it runs theme through all of her writings, is this little church in California that she belongs to. And she said it was people who put the skin on God's sufficiency. She says, it's funny, I always imagined when I was a kid that adults had some kind of inner toolbox full of shiny tools, like the saw of discernment or the hammer of wisdom or the sandpaper of patience. She said, but when I grew up, I found out that life handed you these rusty, bent, old tools. And they are friendships, prayer, conscience, and honesty. She says, do your best that you can do with these, because they will all be all that you have. And against all odds, God gave them to you, and they will be enough. So today, you and I get to make a choice. Will we have enough? All of us agree that God is enough, but how will we facilitate the opening of our heart to allow Him not to fill the way that we've designed our heart, but to overhaul our heart with His priorities, with His desires, with His hopes, and His dreams. And that's when joy, peace, all those things that we seek so desperately will come.